The elevator had stopped between floors 11 and 12 for 6 minutes before anyone believed Caleb Reyes when he said the brake tension logs were falsified. 6 minutes doesn't sound like long until you're the engineer who signed off on a safety system you knew was sound, watching a company blame you for a fall you spent 8 months trying to prevent. That was 4 years ago. Caleb still heard the alarm sometimes, in the quiet after Ellie fell asleep, a sound no one else in the building had ever actually heard ring, and some nights he still reached for a phone that no longer had anyone on the other end who'd believe him if he called. Some stories take a while to show you why they matter. This is one of them, so stay close, and if you like where it's headed, subscribing helps more of these find you. Now Caleb fixed garage doors and stuck deadbolts for a living, a folding table of tools in the back of a rented van, humble work that asked nothing about the 11 years he'd spent designing vertical transport safety systems before Whitcomb Vertical Systems fired him and buried the report that would have cleared his name. His daughter Ellie, 8 years old, thought his job was fixing things that get stuck, which was truer than she knew. Every evening he made her the same dinner, grilled cheese cut into triangles, tomato soup with too much pepper the way she liked it, and every evening, before bed, he walked next door to check on Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb, 83, widowed, living alone since her husband passed. He brought her mail in. He checked her stove was off. He never told her his last real job had anything to do with the company that still bore her family's name. His mornings had their own quiet order. Coffee at 6:15, Ellie's backpack checked twice, a walk past the corner hardware store where the owner, an old-timer named Gus, sometimes waved him in to help price a shipment of hinges, no questions asked about where he'd learned to spot a bad casting from 10 feet away. Caleb kept his answers short on purpose. Picked it up along the way, he'd say, and Gus, who'd learned not to push, let it go. Some mornings, passing the service elevator at the parking garage downtown, Caleb found himself pausing at the control panel, counting the seconds of the door's cycle out of habit, the way another man might check his watch. He hated that his hands still did that. He hated more that some part of him missed it. Ellie noticed too, sometimes, and would tug his sleeve until he kept walking, never asking why, just making sure he did. Margot Whitcomb hadn't visited her grandmother in 4 months, not since the quarterly board audit had swallowed every spare week she had. She arrived on a Tuesday evening with an overnight bag and a folder of documents she hadn't planned to bring, only to have Eleanor mention, almost offhand, that the young man next door had been checking on her every single day since her fall in March. Margot filed that detail away the way she filed away everything, precisely, without letting it show on her face, because as CEO of Whitcomb Vertical Systems, she'd learned that the people who noticed small inconsistencies were the ones who survived boardrooms built on bigger ones. She'd taken over the company 2 years earlier, at 33, inheriting both her grandfather's name on the building and a board full of men who'd known her since she was in pigtails and still sometimes forgot to treat her like the person signing their checks. She managed it by knowing every number cold, inspection intervals, retrofit budgets down to the dollar, the exact percentage of the portfolio still running legacy brake assemblies, because precision was the only language that seemed to make people stop calling her young in meetings. She had learned, over those 2 years, to keep one hand always steady on a railing in slow elevators, a habit so old she rarely noticed she was doing it anymore. It was Caleb who knocked that evening, toolbox in hand, expecting Eleanor. The CEO opened the door instead. "You two know each other?" Eleanor asked from her armchair, and neither of them answered right away, because the honest answer was complicated in ways neither wanted to explain on a doorstep. Margot didn't know it yet, but the woman she reported to twice a year, her own father's old partner, now company chairman, Preston Callahan, had built the last 4 years of his reputation on a decision that ruined the man now fixing her grandmother's porch light. She only knew that something about the way Caleb crouched to check the doorframe hinges, testing weight distribution with 2 fingers before he even opened his toolbox, didn't match a man who fixed garage doors for a living. She came back the following week under the excuse of checking on her grandmother again, and found Caleb in the garage repairing Eleanor's old stairlift, the exact motor assembly Whitcomb Vertical Systems had once manufactured. He diagnosed a torque imbalance in the pulley system before he'd even finished reading the model number, the kind of red that came from someone who'd built the design, not just serviced it. In the corner of his toolbox, half hidden under wrenches, she noticed a small brass elevator emergency release key, old model, company stamped, the kind that hadn't been manufactured in over a decade. Margot didn't ask about the key. Not yet. But she remembered it. She came back a third time the following Sunday, this time with an actual excuse prepared, a squeaking hinge on Eleanor's back door, and watched Caleb reference a torque specification from memory that matched, almost to the decimal, a number she'd seen once in an old engineering manual buried in the company archive. Nobody who'd merely serviced elevators for a living carried numbers like that without looking them up. Ellie, sitting on an overturned bucket nearby, said the thing neither adult would say aloud. My dad used to fix things so big nobody ever got stuck, she told Margot, swinging her legs. Now he only fixes little things. He says it's safer. Margot looked at Caleb, and Caleb looked at his hands, and neither of them corrected the child, because she wasn't wrong. Ellie added, almost as an afterthought, that her dad still kept the important key in his toolbox even though he never used it anymore, which was the first time Margot heard anyone else in the room acknowledge the brass key existed at all. Over the following weeks, Margot pulled old personnel files under the excuse of a routine safety systems audit, cross-referencing engineers dismissed around the same incident that still occasionally surfaced in her nightmares, the 6 minutes she'd spent trapped in a Whitcomb elevator at 9 years old, the year before her father died, an incident the company's official history called a minor mechanical delay. She had never told anyone at the company that the panic she still felt in slow elevators traced back to that exact stalled car. She kept it as private as a wound could be kept in an executive with a public face. If you're new here, this is Velvet Storiez Tales, the kind of story that gets quieter right before it gets loud. The personnel file she finally found, half buried under a decade of routine paperwork, listed a Caleb J. Reyes, senior systems engineer, terminated for gross safety negligence, the same year as a widely reported elevator entrapment at a Whitcomb-serviced building downtown, the same year, she realized with a cold drop in her stomach, as her own childhood incident. The termination letter was signed by Preston Callahan, then Vice President of Operations, now company chairman, the man who still sat 2 seats down from her at every board meeting, calling her kid in front of investors like affection excused 30 years of quiet control. She dug further than the termination letter. An expense report from that same quarter showed Callahan approving a rush retrofit contract at 11% under standard bid, awarded to a vendor with no prior safety certification, the exact cost-cutting measure that would have required exactly the kind of brake tension shortcut Caleb had refused to sign off on. 3 other engineers had raised concerns that year, according to old internal memos, 2 had been quietly reassigned, and 1, Caleb, had been fired outright for refusing to certify a system he knew wasn't safe. She found Ellie's crayon drawing pinned to Caleb's workshop wall one afternoon, a stick figure standing beside an elevator shaft, labeled, "Dad fixed it so nobody falls," and something in Margot's chest went very still, because she recognized the shape of the elevator drawn in green crayon as the exact model her family's company had stopped installing the year Caleb was fired. She confronted the evidence alone before she confronted him. Late one night, she pulled the original 2019 inspection log from the company archive, and found what Caleb had always known: the brake tension figures had been altered by exactly the margin needed to pass inspection while hiding a known fault, the same fault that caused her childhood entrapment and, 4 years later, cost Caleb his career when he refused to sign off on a repeat of the same corner cutting. Preston Callahan's initials were on both documents, 11 years apart, in the same blue ink. She went to Caleb directly, not with accusations, but with the folder placed quietly on his workbench. "I know what he did to you," she said. "And I think I know what he did to me too, a long time before that." Caleb's hands stopped moving over the stairlift motor. For 4 years he had rehearsed 100 versions of being believed, and none of them included a CEO handing him the proof herself. Their private confrontation with Callahan happened 2 nights later, in his office, lit only by a desk lamp he never turned up all the way. Caleb didn't raise his voice. He set the brass emergency release key on the desk beside the falsified log. You buried a brake fault to save $400,000 in retrofit costs, Caleb said quietly. 9 years old, in an elevator, is a long time to wait for someone to check the seams. Callahan's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it, not the number, not the date, not the name of the building. He simply asked what Caleb wanted, in the tone of a man used to negotiating his way out of consequences. Nothing you can give me alone, Caleb said, and left the rest of the room to Margot, who was already standing in the doorway behind him, having heard every word. The board meeting was scheduled for Thursday, ostensibly to review safety certification renewals. 14 directors sat around the table, most unaware anything beyond routine paperwork would be discussed that morning. Margot stood at the head of the table, voice level, laying the 2019 log beside the falsified inspection record projected large enough that no director could pretend not to see the altered decimal points. She named the incident. She named the signature. She read the rush retrofit contract aloud, the 11% discount, the uncertified vendor, the 2 engineers quietly reassigned and the one who wasn't so quietly fired. She did not raise her voice once. This board will decide what happens to Mr. Callahan, she said, but the record already has. Callahan's removal was procedural, unanimous, and entirely without theater, exactly the kind of ending that gives a villain no stage to perform his innocence on. Outside afterward, Caleb stood near his van, unsure which version of his life he was allowed to return to. Margot found him there, the parking lot half lit under a single working street lamp, the kind he might once have flagged for maintenance without thinking twice. Neither of them said the practice things. She reached into her coat pocket and set the brass emergency release key back into his palm, the one he'd left on Callahan's desk. Even a stalled elevator has a way out, she said, if you know where to press. Caleb's fingers closed around it, and around her hand for just a moment longer than the handoff required. Some months later, Whitcomb Vertical Systems quietly restored Caleb Reyes's name to the engineering registry, his original fail-safe design finally credited under his own name in the maintenance manual still used company-wide. Reporters called twice, curious about the engineer who'd been quietly reinstated after 4 years, and Caleb turned both calls down, telling Gus at the hardware store that some vindications didn't need an audience to feel complete. He didn't take an office upstairs. He asked to run the safety testing floor himself, hands on the machines, Ellie's green crayon elevator taped above his workbench where a company memo used to hang. Margot visits Eleanor most weekends now, and stays for dinner most of those visits too, grilled cheese cut into triangles, tomato soup with too much pepper. She rides elevators slower than she used to, but she rides them, and some evenings she stands in the stairwell instead just to walk beside Caleb at his own pace, which has come to feel like its own kind of arrival. She told her board about the childhood incident, eventually, in her own words and her own time, and found that naming it out loud cost her far less than a decade of hiding it had. The story closes on something small. Caleb crouched in the garage, showing Ellie how a brass release key fits into an old mechanism, while through the open door, a woman who once measured her worth by how well she hid what scared her watches a child explain safety like it was always simple. If this story found you at the right moment, that's exactly why we tell these. Thank you for staying until the end, and if you'd like more like it, consider subscribing to Velvet Storiez Tales, where the quiet ones always find their way home.